Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Chris Karate. I'm Vice President of Communications and Events at The Washington Post. Thank you for joining us this morning for our latest Securing Tomorrow conversation. In just a minute, The Washington Post's David Ignatius will sit down with Arkansas Senator Tom Cotton. But first, I want to thank our presenting sponsor, Samsung Electronics America, and welcome to the stage, Johnny Overcast, Senior Director of Samsung's federal government team.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and good morning and welcome to today's great event. We now live in a mobile-first world, in case you didn't know that, right? One in which our mobile devices serve as hubs for work and communication. Just a little over 10 years ago, it's hard to imagine 10 years ago, the smartphone revolution began, and it has reshaped the world. Smartphones now give us persistent and ubiquitous access to information and resources ranging from business applications, driving directions, and dinner reservations, and more. For many of us, smartphones aren't just a convenience, they're simply indispensable. Some agencies are prepared to support the demands of a mobile-first, always-on society, while others are not yet. Yet, as mobile devices now surpass PCs as the primary platform for exchanging data and communications, it has become imperative that all government organizations embrace the rich exchange of in-the-moment information. Samsung is committed to meeting the demands of these organizations by providing an open, customizable, and secure platform to serve as the foundation for this mobile data exchange. We are proud to support the Washington Post Live Securing Tomorrow series as it explores the demands of always-on society. Thank you very much and have a great day.
Thank you so much. I'd now like to welcome to the stage David Ignatius and Senator Tom Cotton. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Chris. And Johnny, it's a special pleasure this morning to welcome Senator Tom Cotton. Senator Cotton, at 40, is, I believe, the youngest member of the U.S. Senate. He's a member.
That's a very low bar to clear. I feel old and worn down in the morning or in the evenings when I'm dealing with my two sons under the age of 3, and then I get to work and I feel young again.
Well,
So I think there's only 7 senators more than twice my age. Only 2 that were elected before I was born. Bonus points if you can guess.
Well, gosh, tell us.
Anyone? Hatch is one.
Yeah, that's good.
She's twice my age but wasn't elected before I was born. McCain is twice my age but wasn't elected before I was born. Leahy.
Aha. Well, you're going to make everyone in the audience, including your moderator, feel very old, so we're going to stop this. Senator Cotton is a member of the Armed Services Committee. He's a member of the Senate Intelligence Committee. He has made, in his short time as a senator, quite a reputation. He was the subject of a fascinating Atlantic Monthly profile that I commend to you, that was written as he was running in 2014 by Molly Ball, called The Making of a Conservative Superstar. Sorry about that.
Freudian slip, David.
This non-Confederate conservative superstar is with us this morning. I should say that he is on the way. We're the warm-up act before Senator Cotton sees President Trump today before noon at the White House. So we want to, be as straightforward with him, direct, ask him some good questions. And I want to start with an issue that I'm sure the President and Senator Cotton are going to talk about. It was the subject of an important speech that the Senator gave Tuesday night at the Council on Foreign Relations, and that's Iran and what to do about certification or non-certification of the Iran nuclear deal. The President next week has to make a decision about what to do about that. It's a real hinge point in our thinking about this agreement and our relationship with Iran. I want to ask you to take us through some of the issues that you talked about in your speech. You said in the speech that we should refuse to certify Iranian compliance with the deal, and I'm quoting here, not primarily on grounds related to Iran's technical compliance, but rather based on the long catalog of the regime's crimes and perfidy against the United States. If I read that right, it's saying Iran may indeed be in technical compliance with the agreement, but we should still decertify it. And the question that I had is, why would any country ever make an agreement with the United States if they thought that even if they were technically complying with it, we might void it? Why would a country do that? Why in particular would North Korea ever consider making a nuclear agreement with us under those circumstances?
Well, first, North Korea doesn't need any pretext to break its own commitments. North Korea has been negotiating and making international commitments for over 50 years, and they seem to make those commitments only so they can violate them, just like with the agreed framework in 1994. But I think it's important, David, to distinguish between the JCPOA itself and U.S. law, specifically the Iran Nuclear Agreement Review Act. The President has to make a decision by October 15th whether to certify under U.S. law not only that Iran is fully, transparently, and verifiably complying with the JCPOA, but also that the JCPOA is in the, quote, vital national security interests of the United States. I would say they're not complying fully and verifiably and transparently on the first point, but more importantly, the second point, it clearly is not in our vital national security interests. The President himself has said it's an embarrassment and the worst deal in U.S. history from the floor of the United Nations General Assembly. That deal ultimately puts the United States in a position of making Iran a legitimate and lawful nuclear power in a mere 8 to 13 years, assuming they don't have a covert nuclear program. In the meantime, it has empowered and enabled Iran's campaign of imperial aggression across the Middle East, which has only gotten worse and more aggressive over the last 2 years. So I think it's time for a new approach. It's time to say to Congress, say to our allies, say to Iran, that this president is not just going to continue a series of half-hearted certifications. He is going to strike out on a new direction. He's going to demand a better deal, and that he's willing to engage in coercive diplomacy to get that.
So I want to ask you what that process might look like. Before I go any further, though, I want to solicit from the audience in this room and watching on streaming on Washington Post Live your questions. I have a way here to pick up questions from all of you. The hashtag is SecuringTomorrow. So if you have questions that you'd like to put to Senator Cotton, please let me know, and I'll be looking at this periodically. So thinking about what would come next, let's assume that the President followed your advice and didn't certify the deal. It would then go to Congress, which could decide whether to reimpose sanctions. If the deal isn't certified, it's possible now for Congress to reimpose sanctions. As I read you in your speech and in your other comments, I'm not clear on whether you think that sanctions should be reimposed or we should go into a kind of period where we're kind of not in but not out. Explain to us what you see happening in that.
So I wouldn't counsel immediately reimposing sanctions. That 60-day window is something that Congress has always had the power to do, which is to reimpose those sanctions or impose new ones, just like the President has had it in his power at all times to reimpose those sanctions, both the U.S. law sanctions and the UN Security Council sanctions. But again, I think the better course would be to engage in a period of diplomacy to try to get better terms to solve the manifest flaws of the deal, flaws of which most people are aware if they follow this debate. Most importantly, the sunset clauses that puts Iran on the path to being a nuclear power in 8 to 13 years. Centrifuge research and development, for which they have no legitimate reason unless they want to build a nuclear weapon. The ballistic missile testing that Iran is using to, again, perfect their ability to deliver nuclear weapons once they have it. The lack of a viable kind of escalating menu of responses when Iran does cheat on the deal. Right now, it's only all snapback sanctions, which is kind of like saying you only get the death penalty for both murder and jaywalking. It makes the West very reluctant to pull the trigger. Those are the main flaws in the deal, and those are what we should work with, President and Congress together, with our European allies, and especially Israel and our Arab allies.
In this period after we have refused to certify but have not yet reimposed
Correct.
sanctions.
Because remember, declining to certify under the Iran Nuclear Agreement Review Act does not withdraw us immediately from the JCPOA. It does not violate any term of the JCPOA. It simply sends the right signal that the President is serious about it, and this is a problem that we are going to address in a matter of weeks or months. It's not going to be years. It's certainly not going to be 2025 to 2030. I mean, because ultimately, the most fundamental problem with the JCPOA in the long term, putting aside Iran's immediate term aggression throughout the Middle East, is that it puts Iran on the path to being a nuclear power. And I have not heard anyone give a single good answer for what happens in the second half of next decade. I mean, in a way, the Obama administration's policy was premised on a fanciful vision of regime change. Well, let's get the breakout time to a year, let's kick the can down the road to 2025 to 2030, and let's hope in the meantime the mythical moderates have prevailed in Tehran. We tried that in North Korea. We see where we are now. And that's one reason why we have so few good options in North Korea, is because we waited too long as dangers gathered.
I understand your argument about magical thinking in the expectation that there'd be significant change, but to be honest, Senator, I worry that there's a little magical thinking in the idea that you can reopen and renegotiate the provisions of a deal that, all told, took 13 years to negotiate. You're describing seeking changes, a different sunset clause, different end date, a different inspection regime, reopening the deal to negotiate those items. If this is going to be a negotiation, what's in it for Iran? Why would Iran
I don't have much confidence that Iran, which is a rogue outlaw regime and the most anti-American regime in the world, is going to sit down. And even if they do, that they will try, as they always do, to drag negotiations out for years. So what I'm proposing is more of an internal allied discussion with the United States, European partners, Israel, Arab allies, that is going to say what we will do. Then let Iran and China and Russia be isolated in a rogues gallery. So for instance, in the inspections regime, Iran continues to refuse to grant access to military facilities. Director Romano at the IAEA just last week said that they lack the tools to fully verify their compliance because they can't access certain facilities under what's known as Section T of the JCPOA, which deals with weaponization and nuclear explosives research. Well, we could say if that is not resolved, then we are going to take these steps. It may not be the full snapback of sanctions. It may be some incremental imposition of sanctions. So what I'm proposing doesn't depend on goodwill with the Iranians reacting in a matter of weeks, or months. It is a largely internal discussion with our allies who have begun to recognize that President Trump takes this seriously. Emmanuel Macron, for instance, has acknowledged the problems with the sunset clauses and the lack of restrictions on ballistic missile and cruise missile testing. That's why the certification decision is so important. Whatever progress has been made over the last 3 months or over the last 6 months, it is because our allies believe the President is serious, not just about declining to certify under U.S. law, but potentially withdrawing from the deal entirely. If the deal is certified again under U.S. law by October 15th, I think that progress will stall. We'll see no more movement in another 75 days. European partners will begin to show a little more leg again, hopefully getting another half-hearted certification. That's why the certification decision under U.S. law is so important.
But Senator, it's true that our European partners in this negotiation think that President Trump may indeed refuse to certify, but from everything I know, it's not correct to say that that's produced useful movement on their part. Indeed, what I hear is that they're deeply concerned that we would do that, think it would be a mistake, and that it might well fragment the coalition against Iran, which has been so important. So if you didn't get the agreement of partners to pursue this course you're describing, and we were doing it alone, essentially, would that still make sense?
Well, for 18 months after the JCPOA was signed, you saw no admissions from European partners, that there were flaws in the deal, that we needed to address the sunset clauses or the weak inspections regime or the missile testing programs. Over the last 6 months, especially over the last 3 months, you have seen some acknowledgement of that. So I think it's worth trying. We won't know, though, until we try, but it is certainly worth trying.
So let me cite the most authoritative person who disagrees with you, at least on the public record. That's a person who is, I would say, second to none as a hawk on Iran, a person who's warned about the Iranian threat and done something about it through many years of command, and that's our Secretary of Defense, General Mattis. And as you know, General Mattis was pressed on this question on Tuesday by Senator Angus King and others when he was testifying. He was asked, would he urge the president to recertify, and he said yes, he thought that was, of course, the president should consider. And then Senator King really pushed him on the core issue. Do you think that it is in the national interest of the United States to remain in this deal, whether this agreement is in the national security interest of the United States? If you saw the clips, you saw General Mattis take a long pause, think about it, and then say, yes, Senator, I do. So he's disagreeing with you about the fundamentals here, that he sees this agreement as being in our national security interest. Why is General Mattis wrong about this, and you're right?
Well, I respect General Mattis, but I disagree with him here. And it's not General Mattis's decision to make, nor is it Rex Tillerson, nor is it Mike Pompeo, nor is it H.R. McMaster. It's the president's decision to make. They advise, he decides. I have not heard from anyone, no one in the cabinet, no one outside the government, the answer to the fundamental question of what happens in the second half of the last decade, or the next decade. Moreover, in almost every way, delay plays into Iran's hands. It allows them to strengthen and grow their economy. It creates more time for Western businesses to entrench themselves in Iran's economy, creating a pro-Iran lobby inside our countries. It allows them to get closer and closer to a breakout time of a matter of weeks, not 1 year, not even months. It allows them to continue to sow chaos and discord throughout the region. So is often the case when dealing with a weaker but aggressive revisionist power, time is not on our side. Time is on their side, just as you saw in North Korea in the 1990s and 2000s.
So let me cite one more piece of what you might call rebuttal evidence. A number of prominent Israeli national security professionals have said, and have been quoted in Israeli news accounts, as taking essentially the same position that General Mattis does, that as they look at Israel's national security interests, having the limits on enrichment, having the limits on numbers of centrifuges, having the cap on heavy water production and storage, make Israel safer for the period of this agreement, and for that reason, they would prefer that it remain in place. So, I mean, they're speaking from the neighborhood. How do you answer that criticism? I know Prime Minister Netanyahu takes a different view, but as you well know, there are a lot of Israelis who would say, we agree with General Mattis.
So first, I'd say the same thing about members of the Israeli General Staff or other members of their security establishment that I would say about our cabinet and our military. They are elected to make those decisions. Donald Trump is elected. Benjamin Netanyahu is elected to make those kind of essentially statesmanship questions, not generalship questions. And I've heard from not just Prime Minister Netanyahu, but other people who are directly accountable to him that Israel cannot live with this agreement. As you said, for the term of the agreement, if we assume that Iran is not cheating, if they're not hiding facilities the size of a football field inside a country 2.5 times the size of Texas, even if they agree with every single term, by the second half of the next decade, they will be a lawful and legitimate nuclear power. I don't think we can live with that. I don't think Israel can live with that. I don't think our Arab allies can live with that. So that's the fundamental point that I would make, that, again, I have heard no answer for what happens in 2025 to 2030. And in the meantime, that deal has enabled and empowered Iran to become more aggressive in their campaign for regional hegemony. Not just because Iran received over $100 billion in sanctions relief, but because they know that the last administration and most of the other members of this deal are more worried about the deal being broken than they are about Iran not just supplying rockets to Hezbollah, which they've done for a long time, but now building missile factories on Israel's border, sending missiles to Houthi rebels that can not only shut down the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, but also reach Jeddah and Riyadh.
And just a final question, then we'll leave it because there's so many other things I want to talk about. In dealing with these regional issues, and I agree, I think any analyst who looks at the Middle East agrees that Iranian behavior in the region is aggressive and dangerous. Through their proxies mining the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. They are now said to be able to range Abu Dhabi and Riyadh with missiles that are placed in Yemen. Serious problems. Why isn't it easier to deal with those problems when you have the nuclear agreement in place and that part of the Iranian danger is capped in a way that seems to be verifiable, reasonably verifiable, through 2025?
Well, I think for the Trump administration, they feel that they can tackle both problems. They can try to strengthen the JCPOA and confront Iran's aggression. In the Obama administration, clearly they didn't want to confront Iran's aggression because they were worried Iran, having pocketed $100 billion, might walk away from the JCPOA. But you know what's really hard to do? To confront their aggression in the Middle East when they have a nuclear weapon, which is where we'll be in the latter part of the next decade. Again, that's the blink of an eye in the life of a nation. That's why these dangers gather over time. Now, another premise of most of your questions, David, and most of the argument about this, is that we don't have a credible military option, which is simply false. President Obama often implied that the only choice we had was capitulation under the JCPOA or a decade of occupation after forcible regime change through the introduction of 150,000 mechanized troops like we had in Iraq. That's simply not the case. We have a number of calibrated military strikes like Ronald Reagan conducted against Libya, like Bill Clinton conducted repeatedly against Iraq, like Donald Trump conducted against Syria, like Ronald Reagan conducted against Iran itself by blowing up half of their navy and several oil platforms, which I would point out wasn't too long before the Iran-Iraq war ended. Ehud Barak has said Iran's nuclear infrastructure could be destroyed in a fraction of a night. I would say that's probably a little optimistic, but again, we have options between capitulation under this deal and forcible regime change followed by a decade of occupation. And Iran needs to know that.
So I'm going to turn to other subjects. You've teed up what is a huge public policy choice for the president. As I say, you'll, I'm sure, be talking about it with him in a couple of hours. I hope we warmed you up, and we'll be following this with great interest. I want to turn to something that's been haunting all of us, haunting the country, I'm sure haunting you, and that's what happened last weekend in Las Vegas. And I want to begin by quoting the lead guitarist of one of the country music bands that played before Jason Aldean and the carnage that we've watched in the footage. This is a guitarist named Caleb Keeter. I'm quoting something he said. "I've been a proponent of the Second Amendment my entire life until the events of last night. I cannot express how wrong I was. Enough is enough. We need gun control right now. My biggest regret is that I stubbornly didn't realize it until my brothers on the road and myself were threatened by it." So here's, as he says, a lifelong Second Amendment supporter confronted with the level of this violence, this automatic gunfire. You know more than anybody in this room what automatic weapons can do. You've seen them chew up human beings in Iraq and Afghanistan. So let me ask you whether in the aftermath of this you've had new reflections of your own, and in particular, whether you'd be willing to support controls on these so-called bump stock conversion kits that turn what are supposedly not automatic weapons into ones that can fire this way?
Well, first, David, let me just express my deepest condolences and sympathies to the loved ones and families and friends of everyone who was murdered or injured in this terrible mass murder episode. I think it's too soon to draw conclusions because the investigation is ongoing. I've seen media reports, but I haven't seen confirmed official reports of exactly what happened, what kinds of firearms were fired, how they were obtained, and so forth. Automatic weapons have been strictly regulated in this country for 80 years. They've been nearly prohibited for 30 years since the 1986 amendments to the National Firearms Act. You can still buy ones that were in circulation for 1986, but it's under very strict government regulation, even stiffer background check. I'm not sure if the shooter had one of those or not. I haven't seen reports of that. You would think that government records would indicate if he did. I'd be willing to entertain any kind of device that turns a semi-automatic weapon, which is defined simply as one pull of the trigger equals 1 round discharge, into an automatic weapon, which means one pull of the trigger equals an unlimited number of rounds discharge until your ammunition is expired or until your barrel overheats. For the same reasons that we strictly control automatic weapons in this country. We'll wait for the conclusions of the investigation to come forward and see what the current law says and what authorities the ATF has, but I'd be willing to entertain those.
So I don't think I've seen your name publicly identified with this idea that perhaps we should have new controls on these conversion kits. So that to me is...
Well, I would say too that we shouldn't necessarily expect to change the world with these kind of steps, though. Look, again, the media reports say, they've not been verified, so I can't speak for certain, but the media reports say that this man had no criminal record, he had no history of mental illness, he passed every background check that was required when he bought those firearms. Bump firing is not a new thing, nor do you need a conversion kit or a stock to do that. I saw lots of skilled soldiers who can go to the firing range and take a M4, which is the military version of an AR-15, and empty a magazine through bump firing. It takes a little bit of practice, but it's something that can be done just through skilled marksmanship, not through a technique. So again, we shouldn't expect to change the world with these things, but it's something that we should consider once we have all the facts and circumstances at hand.
Let me ask you one more question post Las Vegas. There have been times in our history where there's been a sense that we have a problem that we just don't know how to deal with. And there are sharply competing arguments about why that problem exists. But I think nobody in our country can look at that level of killing and not think we're looking in the mirror here, not think that there's something that we ought to deal with somehow. So I've thought back in our history when we had big problems. Sometimes we've had a national commission that has people of very different viewpoints. The Kerner Commission that dealt with early civil rights issues was an example, but there are others where these commissions meet and they talk in private and they're real and responsible discussions. Would you have any interest in supporting an idea like that, not prejudging what it would say, but just being a process where the country could get together and think, what are we going to do about this?
That's an interesting idea, David. Sometimes commissions are a way for politicians in Washington to punt a problem off, but sometimes they do gather real valuable information and analysis and insights, as with the 9/11 Commission, for instance. And clearly, none of us wants to see another mass shooting. At the same time, the Second Amendment protects Americans' right to own firearms. And I know lots of Arkansans who own multiple firearms, to include this guy. And we can't infringe upon the constitutional rights of Americans. So we'd have to define such a commission's remit carefully. But I do think that most Americans are appalled at the kind of mass murder that we saw in Las Vegas or that we've seen in other places. And every person of goodwill should want to try to examine its causes and see what we can do consistent with the individual rights of American citizens.
So if such a commission was bounded by the obligation of its members to understand we're a country that has a constitutional amendment that protects the right to own firearms, but also every member recognize that we have a terrible national problem. We don't understand exactly where it comes from, what to do about it. That's something that you would at least
again,
consider.
I'd want to see the parameters of it, but studying this problem, and it's not just mass murder either, it's murder on a mass scale, as you see in cities like Chicago. You know, Chicago hasn't had the kind of murder that the mass murder we've seen in Las Vegas or Orlando or Virginia Tech, but on really bad weekends or week, it can add up to that scale as well. So I'd want to examine the problems that we have with growing rates of violence to include mass murders in this country.
So I want to turn now to another issue on which you've been outspoken, but also I think more provocative than people may realize, and that's the issue of immigration. Unlike some hardliners on immigration, as I read your comments, you would not necessarily call for deportation of the so-called DACA dreamers under some solution that Congress might come to, as President Trump has requested. But you said that you think the price for any compromise that allows some sort of permanent resident status for these DACA dreamers should be basically a new deal on immigration that protects American workers and their interests better. And I'd love for you just to explain to the audience how you see that, how the pieces of that trade-off would come out.
So let me, before I get to that specific piece of potential legislation, let me back up and think about immigration a little more broadly. It's a very important issue. It's a very controversial issue because it's cross-cutting on so many other issues in terms of the economy and jobs and wages, security, community, public services, and so forth. Congress has failed 3 times in 11 years to pass what they call comprehensive immigration reform, which primarily means amnesty first, enforcement later, i.e. enforcement never, and mass immigration. The most recent time was in 2013. I was in Congress for that one. I helped stop the so-called Gang of 8 bill in the House. Had 3 main components. One is mass migration under our legal immigration systems, increasing the number of green cards, which is about 1 million people a year right now. Every year, we give out about the state of Montana's worth of green cards, plus millions and millions of temporary guest workers under the high-tech programs, under agricultural programs, and so forth. The second category is security enforcement measures. The wall, visa overstay systems, ICE enforcement and personnel, immigration judges, and so forth. The third category is what to do about illegal immigrants who are here today, about 12 million. I've introduced legislation to focus on the first problem, and really only a subset of the first problem, which is green cards. The administration has most of the authority they need for security and enforcement. The third question, I think, is politically impossible for Congress to handle until we have more confidence on the first 2 categories of the American people. So the legislation I have with David Perdue would fundamentally alter our green card system away from one that was designed for last century's country and economy into one designed for this century's country and economy. We would prioritize high-skilled immigrants who are able to come to this country, stand on their own 2 feet, pay taxes, not use welfare, contribute to our economy, probably create jobs on their own. And we do that in the way that Australia and Canada does, by creating a point system that's very easy to administer and very objective on things like your educational attainment and field, your English language ability, the salary you've been offered relative to the median salary in your geographic locale, your ability to bring large amounts of money into this country and investment and actively manage it, your age, and any kind of exceptional abilities or achievements that you've had. So now, going to the particular question that the President's correct decision to stop the unlawful DACA program makes. President Trump says he doesn't have legal authority to continue this program. He's right. Don't take his word for it. President Obama said he didn't have the legal authority to implement that program before he went ahead and did it in 2012 in the middle of a re-election campaign. So that program is going to begin to unwind by March 5th unless Congress does something. The President has said he would like to see a legislative solution for the 800,000 or so illegal immigrants who have received a DACA permit. I'm willing to work with him on that and with my Democratic and Republican colleagues in the Senate and the House. You said the price of that work. I would put it a different way. I would put it in terms of kind of control the effects of that action. If you codify the DACA program, you're going to create two negative side effects. The first one is you're going to create a new chain for chain migration, for people to bring into this country legally, not just spouses and unmarried minor children, which is what my bill would do, but their parents who created the problem in the first place, their adult siblings, spouses, and then that creates another unlimited chain. The second negative side effect is you're going to encourage more illegal immigration. Obviously, I mean, imagine if you lived in El Salvador and you had a 3-year-old living in the most dangerous country in the world, more dangerous than Syria, more dangerous than Afghanistan, more dangerous than any other country in the world. And the United States just gave citizenship to people who were brought here as children 20 and 30 years ago. What kind of risks would you take to come here now and hope that your child can benefit from the next amnesty in 10 or 15 years? They'd probably be pretty significant, and they'd be very dangerous for you and that child. So there's two problems you need to control for those two negative side effects. The first is simply to end chain migration. Stop admitting people to this country who we have no idea if they can contribute effectively to our economy and to our society. The second, there's more flexibility there. It could be building a wall, it could be building a visa overstay system, it could be using employment verification systems at the workplace, adding more immigration judges to clear out backlogs, adding more ICE agents. There's a whole menu of things you could look at to control illegal immigration, which will be more incentivized under a DACA deal. But that's the way I would put it. It is a small package. It's not trying to boil the ocean. It's not going to be a fourth run at comprehensive immigration reform, but it would solve the problem the president has said he would like to see solved while mitigating those two negative side effects.
Let me ask a crass question. How many votes do you think you have for that approach?
A majority.
Do you?
Look, I mean, the House of Representatives could pass that bill. I have no doubt about that. I served in the House. I have many friends there. I serve it. Democrats in the Senate have said they won't take anything. You saw Nancy Pelosi, for instance, get heckled and protested by many of the young illegal immigrant activists who say they won't, they're not going to accept anything other than complete amnesty, not just for them, but for everyone. Well, if that's the case, then we're not going to have a solution. But if the House of Representatives passes a good bill that can codify DACA while also controlling for those negative side effects by ending chain migration and improving enforcement, well, it's up to Chuck Schumer and Dick Durbin and the Senate Democrats. Do they want to give legal status to the people that they said they've defended for all these years, or do they want to see it expire on March 5th? That'll be their decision.
Just focus in on a little subchapter of this immigration story. You gave a very interesting, as I said earlier, provocative speech about this at a college in Michigan recently. And in that, in talking about how we got into the current immigration situation, you would say a mess, you had some pretty harsh language about the elites who've made, in your view, immigration policy favor immigration. You call them the cosmopolitan elites, the pampered elites, the overeducated elites. And I want to ask you about that last line.
Those are my kind words.
So I want to ask you about that, this terrible overeducated elite that's wrecking the country. And I ask this not facetiously. You're a graduate of Harvard College. You're a graduate of Harvard Law School.
But I'm a son of Yell County, Arkansas. And by the way, that's spelled Y-E-L-L.
So I understand your background and admire all the things you've done, but are you overeducated?
I would say that I'm more connected to the places in the country that understand the negative side of immigration. Look, if you live in Washington, you live in New York, you live in LA or San Francisco, most of the benefits of immigration are on the upside, especially for those people who are in upper income brackets there, as we have inside the Beltway, the 4 richest counties in America. But when you live in other places where people work with their hands and they work on their feet, where they take a shower after they get off work, not before they go to work, you see a lot of the downsides of immigration. You see wages that have stagnated for 40 years for people with a high school degree or less. You see schools and hospitals that are over capacity. You see jobs that once provided a decent middle-class living for blue-collar workers not available anymore. So there is a real problem with our elites, and this is not just an American problem, this is a global problem. I mean, talk to the people in London about the Brexit vote. You saw very similar patterns that we saw in our election last year, and the people who are advocating for Brexit said that uncontrolled migration within the EU was one of the driving factors there. In Germany, you just had a right-wing party, the AfD, get elected to the Bundestag for the first time since World War II, and the single core issue was Chancellor Merkel's decision to throw open the doors of Europe 2 years ago without any kind of democratic consultation or legitimacy. Bernie Sanders, remember, got the same number of votes, or I'm sorry, the same percentage of votes in his primary that Donald Trump got in my party's primary. He probably would have won if it hadn't been for the way the Democrats have superdelegates. And he was an immigration skeptic for many years, just like Barbara Jordan, a liberal Democrat, was as well. So yes, the people who tend to be highly educated, who live in New York and Washington and Chicago and San Francisco and LA, simply do not appreciate the downsides of immigration, the same way that those elites who live in London and Paris and Brussels and Berlin don't appreciate the downsides of it.
I'm not really arguing, Senator, the case you're making about out-of-touch elites and their views about immigration. I'm specifically asking you about taking a shot at the overeducated. And the reason that I ask that is that I've always had the impression that our system of education, especially of higher education, the overeducated people who went to Harvard, is one of our great national resources. I, this summer, heard the Vice Chancellor of Oxford say that in this environment where many our top researchers fear that there's a public mood that's anti-education elite, that they may not be able to sustain funding for their labs, so they're beginning to talk to Oxford and other universities about moving their labs to someplace that may be more hospitable. If that happens, I think we've really suffered a national security problem. And I'll bet you agree with me, and that's why I want to ask you on this question of education.
So there's a story about Calvin Coolidge's son. One summer, between his years in college, he was picking tobacco in Connecticut, back when Connecticut still was a big tobacco hub. And he was doing that with some local kids who were not in college. And they knew that he was in college. And one of them said, "So, college boy, what does your dad do for a living?" And Coolidge's son said, "Well, he's the president." And the kid said, "President of the United States?" And Coolidge's son said, "Yes." And the kid said, "You know, if my dad was president, I don't think I'd be picking tobacco in the summer." And Coolidge's son said, "If your dad was my dad, you would." And that's a real problem with our educated elite, if you don't like overeducated, that they don't have those kind of experiences. They do gap years and they travel around the world, and they go straight to work at the premier banks or consulting firms or corporations. They come to Washington, they do policy analysis. They haven't worked on farms, they haven't served in the military, they haven't seen so much of what the previous generation saw. Look at people like John F. Kennedy or George H.W. Bush, very well educated, Ivy League, patrician families, but they both went out and served in the military. And that wasn't just a marker of their patriotism and their sacrifice and bravery, that also exposed them to all kinds of people whom they would have never met at boarding schools in New England and at Ivy League colleges and at Wall Street banks and law firms. I think that's a real problem with the elites in our society. But again, it's not just our society, it's across the world as well. And if we had more people with those experiences, I think we'd have a little bit more trust in the elites in our society. Not just politicians, but people in media and the academy and business and so forth.
That's a good answer. I just want to ask you to take the next step. So that sounds like something that General McChrystal has advocated, which is some program of national service, that we have some way, not necessarily serving in the military, for that shared undertaking of Americans to be easier for people to experience. Would you favor that? So
I admire General McChrystal and his efforts on this front very much. I can't say that I would favor making it compulsory or mandating it. I certainly wouldn't do so with the military. you talk to most of our flag officers, our generals and admirals, they'll say that our military is the best it's ever been with an all-volunteer force. Some countries have to have compulsory service, like Israel, a country that is small and near its adversaries. We don't, because we're a country that is very big and we're far from our adversaries. However, I do, when I speak to high school students and college students, which I do with some frequency, encourage them all to join the military. Preferably the Army, but the other three are good too. But I tell them all, especially the college students who are here in Washington, D.C., in the summer on internships, who probably come from upper middle class or rich families. Look, I know you're all eager to get out and make your mark in Wall Street or law firms or tech startup world. All that stuff is going to be there when you're 25 or 26. That may seem like you're going to be old as the hills, everything's going to pass you by, but trust me, if you will spend 3 or 4 years serving our country's armed forces, it will be the best thing you do in the long run. Still the best thing that I ever did in the long run in terms of the experience you'll get, the responsibilities you will earn, the leadership you'll see, and the skills that you will carry on with you in the future. Not necessarily tangible skills. In the infantry, we don't learn a lot of tangible skills that we can take out into the civilian world. I mean, you can't knock down a bunker and take a trench line in the civilian world. But the intangible skills, the leadership, the mission focus, the discipline, the teamwork, that's why companies like Walmart or JP Morgan or UPS make it such a priority to try to hire veterans.
Should just note, for anybody who doesn't know the Senator's biography, he won a Bronze Star for his service as an infantry officer in Iraq and Afghanistan. I want to ask you one final area, and then we've got to let you go vote, something you senators have to do at awkward times. Ask you to put on your hat as a member of the Senate Intelligence Committee. Your chairman and ranking member, Senator Burr and Senator Warner, yesterday gave a kind of progress report. And they said that they think, and I want to ask you whether you would agree with this, that your investigation so far, it's going to continue, but your investigation so far has basically confirmed that the report by the intelligence community that was issued January 6th that said that Russia had interfered in our 2016 presidential election, that allegation is accurate. Do you share that judgment?
Yes, I have no reason to doubt the conclusions of the intelligence community assessment. I might have one question that I haven't yet resolved about one small point on motivation behind Russian activities.
And explain what you mean by that.
Well, but let me finish that. In terms of Russia hacking into those emails and releasing them, I have no reason to doubt that. And now it would appear that Russian intelligence services also tried to use social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter and Google and so forth to influence public opinion as well. We're going to dig a little bit more into that. We have a public hearing coming up soon, as they mentioned yesterday. That's not a surprise. That's what Russia does. I mean, Russia was behind much of the nuclear freeze movement in 1983 because they were afraid of the deployment of intermediate range nuclear forces to Europe. So the question about motivation, I think if I recall, there were 4 main motivations behind Russia's activities. One was simply to sow chaos and discord in our democracy. I mean, again, that's just what Russia does, not just in the United States, but throughout Europe. A second was if they could to try to embarrass, hurt, retaliate against Hillary Clinton. Vladimir Putin has long nursed grudges against the Clintons, not just from Hillary Clinton's time as Secretary of State, but also from the last few years of the Clinton administration in the 1990s and the way he was perceived as treated then. Final one.
And I take it you'd see the evidence supporting that. Second.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, it totally stands to reason. Again, Vladimir Putin, likes to retaliate against people that he views having slighted him. Final question. I think we still have some final question motivation about which we still have some question is the affirmative desire to try to help elect Donald Trump. I think we still have some questions we need to ask about that. Those aren't really classified questions. They're just more common sense questions. Donald Trump campaigned on a platform of increasing defense spending, accelerating nuclear modernization, expanding ballistic missile defenses, producing more American oil and gas. None of those things look good if you sit in the Kremlin. Hillary Clinton was more or less opposed or didn't take those to the same degree. So I think it's important that we ask the questions why Vladimir Putin and Russian intelligence would have wanted someone who took those views in the White House when they could have had someone with more friendly policy views, someone who was more committed to carrying on the Obama foreign policy legacy, which helped enable Vladimir Putin's aggression, not just against the United States, but around the world. Remember, Barack Obama was the one that told Mitt Romney in a contemptuous manner that the 1980s wanted their foreign policy back when Mitt Romney said Russia was our #1 geopolitical threat. So I think it's worth probing more on that. But on the underlying factual question, I have no reason to doubt that Russia hacked into those emails and released them, and now it would appear tried to use social media to influence public opinion as well, which is again what they do in France and in Germany and in Montenegro and in Catalonia and everywhere else.
Your Republican chairman, Senator Burr, said that on one possible answer to your question of why would the Russians have supported Trump, the question that we call collusion, that the evidence has not yet emerged to support that, but you're going to continue to look in your investigation to see if there was any, he said, hint of collusion. Is that a good way to put it?
That's the way I would characterize it as well. I've seen no evidence of that, but we've, as Chairman Burr and Vice Chair Warner said, we've reviewed hundreds of thousands of pages. We've done I think over 100 interviews now. I can tell you personally, this is probably the matter on which we've spent the most time in my 3 years on that committee. So we're going to follow the facts wherever they lead us, and we're not going to jump to any conclusions before we get all the facts. Hopefully we can do that sooner rather than later, and hopefully we can make as much of that public as possible. I think that is in the public's interest, and that's in the interest of both of our parties. It's in the president's interest, and also it's in the interest of our democratic processes in the future. We're still having elections. Virginia and New Jersey are having an election for their governor in just a few weeks. We have primaries coming up next year and then midterms. All of our states need to be vigilant about the risk of Russian or other adversarial meddling in our elections. And I don't just mean putting up a random Twitter account or hacking to someone's email. I mean trying to hack into voting calculations. Zero evidence that happened anywhere in the country last year. But we shouldn't be complacent just because it didn't happen in 2016 that it might not happen in the future. And our states in particular, governors, legislatures, secretaries of states, need to take proper steps to ensure the integrity of their electoral processes.
We need to get you to your vote. I have one question on the way out that I want to ask you. Are you confident, Senator, that President Trump will not seek to interfere in the investigation that is being conducted by Special Counsel Robert Mueller? And if there was an attempt to fire Mueller, as has been rumored in the past, would you join with other Republican and Democratic senators who've stated that they would seek, through legislation, to establish some alternative way that would be legal under our Constitution to have a 3-judge panel appoint a new special counsel so that the investigation could continue?
So first, I have no reason to believe that'll happen. Second, I don't think that legislation is consistent with our Constitution. The independent counsel statute, in my opinion, was a constitutional abomination. In Morrison v. Olson, Justice Scalia wrote one of his greatest opinions in dissent explaining why it was unconstitutional. And although it was a minority of one, if I recall, I think pretty much everyone in our political system agreed about 10 years later after the Starr investigation concluded that Justice Scalia had gotten that one right and the majority had gotten it wrong.
So this has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you for joining us. I hope we warmed you up for Mr. President. Our next guest in this Securing Tomorrow series will be Kay Bailey Hutchinson, former senator from Texas, and now our ambassador to NATO. That'll be next week. Please join us. Thank you, Senator, for coming.
Thank you, David.